The bank sent Marcus Fielding to read me my family's foreclosure notice and see me off the property within a week. And instead of reading it, he folded the paper back into his coat, picked up a hammer from my own tool shed, and started fixing my south fence without another word about the document he'd ridden 2 hours to deliver. My name is Clara Renner, and I was 29 years old that spring, running 160 acres of Nebraska homestead land alone since my husband Daniel's death from fever 2 years before, a death that had left me not only grieving but considerably behind on the note we'd taken out against the property during a difficult harvest 3 years earlier, a debt I had been managing, barely, through my own exhausted effort, until the bank's patience apparently reached its limit that particular spring. Daniel and I had claimed this land under the Homestead Act 6 years before his death, proving it up together through the particular grueling combination of hard work and stubborn optimism the law required of anyone hoping to eventually own their acreage outright. And I had come to love this stretch of prairie with a fierceness that surprised me at the time, having grown up in a considerably more settled part of Ohio before Daniel's own restless ambition brought us west. His death had left me not merely grieving, but genuinely uncertain, those first months, whether a widow alone could reasonably manage what we had built together, a doubt I had spent 2 years working to disprove through sheer exhausted persistence, though the note's mounting interest had proven, in the end, a more stubborn adversary than any single season's weather or any amount of my own determined labor. If Marcus Fielding had done his job as instructed that afternoon, I stood to lose the only home I had left within 7 days, turned out with whatever I could carry onto land my own father-in-law had originally claimed under the Homestead Act, land that held, in every practical sense, the whole of what remained of my life with Daniel. I want to be honest that I did not understand, watching Marcus fold that notice away unread, why a bank's own agent would risk his employment on my behalf, a stranger he'd met perhaps 20 minutes before, and I spent considerable time that first week suspicious of a kindness I could not properly account for. Marcus arrived at my gate that Tuesday afternoon in the particular formal manner of a man conducting official business he found personally distasteful, dismounting with his leather satchel in hand and the careful, measured posture of someone who had delivered difficult news often enough to have developed a professional composure around it. He introduced himself, explained his purpose plainly, and withdrew a folded document from his satchel that I understood, even before he'd properly opened it, contained the particular language that would end my tenancy on this land within a week. I remember noticing, even in that first tense moment, a particular hesitation in his movements that I did not yet understand, a slight reluctance in how he unfolded the paper, as though his hands themselves were working against whatever instructions had brought him to my gate. He unfolded that notice perhaps 6 inches, enough to glance at the header, and then, in a motion I did not properly understand until considerably later, folded it back along its original crease and returned it to his coat pocket entirely unread. I stood there several long seconds, simply watching him do this, my mind working through several possible explanations, each one considerably less plausible than the reality I would eventually come to understand. "Mrs. Renner," he said, "I understand your south fence has been down since the spring thaw. I noticed it riding in. I'd like to fix that for you, if you'll permit me, before we discuss anything further regarding the bank's business." "I don't understand," I said, and I want to record that my confusion was entirely genuine, since a bank's agent offering fence repair, rather than delivering an eviction notice, was not a sequence of events I had any prior experience to properly interpret. "Aren't you here to read me the foreclosure notice?" "I'm here on the bank's business," Marcus said, which was, I would come to understand over the following days, a particular kind of careful truth that revealed considerably less than it appeared to. "I find fence work considerably more useful than paperwork most afternoons, Mrs. Renner. I'll get to the rest of it eventually." He spent the remainder of that first afternoon repairing my south fence with the particular quiet thoroughness of a man who took genuine satisfaction in physical work done properly, and I want to record that I watched him from my kitchen window with a suspicion I did not fully examine until several days had passed, wondering what a bank's agent could possibly want from a widow with nothing left to offer beyond the very land he'd presumably come to reclaim. He worked without pause until the light failed, checking each post's stability with the particular careful attention of a man raised around such labor, rather than simply performing it as an unfamiliar chore, and when he finally rode back toward town that evening, he said only that he'd return the following day to continue, offering no further explanation of the notice still folded in his coat pocket, leaving me standing at my own gate, turning the entire strange encounter over in my mind long after his horse had disappeared down the road. He returned the following day, and the day after that, each time finding some fresh piece of ranch work requiring attention, a sagging barn door, a cracked water trough, a section of roof that had been troubling me since the previous winter, and each time deflecting my increasingly direct questions about the foreclosure notice with the particular practiced vagueness of a man who had clearly decided, for reasons he was not yet willing to explain, that delaying the bank's business considerably outweighed whatever risk that delay posed to his own position. I found myself, by the third day, bringing him coffee at mid-morning and again in the afternoon, a small gesture of hospitality that felt, at the time, considerably safer than properly examining why exactly I looked forward to his arrival each morning, with an anticipation that had nothing whatsoever to do with the fence work itself. "You're going to lose your position," I told him plainly, on the fourth day, watching him repair the barn door with the same careful attention he'd brought to everything else. "Whatever reason you have for this, Marcus, the bank sent you here with clear instructions, and I don't imagine they'll be pleased to learn a week has passed without their business being properly concluded. I've seen what banks do to agents who don't follow instructions properly, and I don't wish that particular consequence on you, whatever your reasons for this delay." Marcus set down his tools and looked at me directly, in a way he had generally avoided during our previous conversations, and I understood, watching his face in that moment, that he had finally decided the explanation I'd been requesting was owed to me properly, rather than continuing to be deflected. He wiped his hands slowly on a rag from his belt, the particular deliberate motion of a man gathering himself before saying something he'd clearly been holding back with considerable effort. "My own family lost a homestead to a bank foreclosure when I was 12 years old," he said. "Kansas, considerably harder circumstances than yours, and considerably less time than the week I'm supposed to be giving you. I watched my father receive that notice with less than 72 hours to vacate, on account of a technicality in our own note that the bank's president had, I came to understand years later, deliberately structured to force exactly that outcome, because he wanted our particular stretch of land for reasons that had nothing to do with the debt itself and everything to do with a survey he'd seen months before anyone else in the county." He paused, looking out toward the open prairie rather than at me, and I watched something considerable move across his face, the particular weight of a memory he had clearly carried carefully for over 2 decades without often speaking it aloud. "My father never fully recovered from that, Mrs. Renner. Not financially, and not in some other way I don't have adequate words for. He took work as a hired hand for the rest of his life, a man who'd once owned his own land reduced to working someone else's, and I watched that particular diminishment happen slowly over years, until I finally understood, well into my own adulthood, exactly what had been taken from him and exactly how deliberately. I want to explain, plainly, what Marcus eventually helped me understand about my own situation, because it mirrors his family's history closely enough that I do not believe the resemblance was coincidental. Horace Pruitt, the county bank's president, had been quietly acquiring detailed knowledge of a planned railroad spur's likely route for the better part of a year, information not yet public but available to a man with sufficient banking connections in the territorial capital, and had begun, some months before my own note came due, deliberately tightening terms on properties along that likely route, calling in notes early, adjusting interest calculations in ways technically defensible but practically punishing, all with the apparent goal of forcing foreclosures he could then acquire cheaply through intermediaries before the railroad's actual route became general knowledge and land values along it rose considerably. "I can't prove all of it yet," Marcus told me that fourth evening, "but I've seen enough of Pruitt's recent foreclosure pattern, properties along roughly the same stretch of country your own land sits within, to believe your situation isn't simple bad luck with a difficult note. I believe you're caught in the same particular scheme that cost my own family everything, and I decided, riding out here with that notice in my satchel, that I wasn't prepared to be the hand that executed it a second time without at least attempting to understand it properly first. I did not fully trust this explanation, that fourth evening, though I want to record that I found myself wanting to, which was its own kind of dangerous vulnerability I hadn't properly examined in the 2 years since Daniel's death. "Even if you're right," I said, "what precisely do you intend to do about it? You're one bank agent, Marcus, against your own employer's president. I've watched powerful men in this county act with near total impunity before, and I don't have any particular reason to believe Pruitt would prove different, whatever evidence you manage to gather. I intend," Marcus said, "to find proof considerable enough that Pruitt can't simply dismiss it, and I intend to do that before your week runs out, which gives me considerably less time than I'd prefer but more than none at all." He looked at me steadily, the particular directness he'd shown so rarely in our previous days' conversations. "I understand the risk I'm asking you to accept, trusting a plan I can't yet fully prove will succeed. I'd understand if you preferred I simply proceed with the notice as originally instructed, rather than gambling your remaining days on an uncertain investigation. "I've had considerably worse gambles offered me these past 2 years," I said, "and considerably fewer honest men offering them. I'll take my chances with your investigation, Marcus, whatever it costs either of us if it fails to bear out properly." Marcus spent the following days dividing his attention between the ranch work he'd been quietly performing and a careful private investigation into the bank's recent foreclosure records, work he conducted largely at night after riding back to town, cross-referencing note dates and interest adjustments against what territorial survey information he could locate through a former colleague now working the land office in the capital. He explained, one evening that week, that the work required a particular delicate patience since asking too many direct questions risked alerting Pruitt to exactly the scrutiny Marcus was attempting to avoid until he possessed evidence considerable enough that dismissal or denial would prove considerably harder to manage. The confrontation with Horace Pruitt came on the 6th day, when Marcus rode into the bank's own office with considerably more evidence than he'd possessed 4 days before. Evidence connecting Pruitt's recent pattern of foreclosures to a private survey map obtained months before public announcement. A map Marcus had located through the same land office colleague, bearing Pruitt's own handwritten notations along the exact stretch of country that included my property. Marcus described to me, afterward, the particular careful calculation involved in choosing that specific morning to confront Pruitt directly, timed deliberately for the day before my own notice's deadline expired, giving Pruitt as little opportunity as possible to quietly resolve the matter through some other means before the full weight of the evidence could be properly presented. He had spent the previous evening drafting a formal complaint to the Territorial Banking Commission as well, a document he carried alongside the survey map, prepared to file it immediately should Pruitt attempt to simply dismiss him or bury the confrontation through some quieter internal maneuvering rather than genuine accountability. "This is a considerable accusation to bring against your own employer," Pruitt said, when confronted directly in his office, his composure holding with the particular practiced smoothness of a man who had clearly weathered scrutiny before. "A survey map proves nothing beyond my own reasonable interest in the county's future development. Any prudent banker keeps himself informed of regional developments likely to affect property values, Mr. Fielding. I'd think you'd understand that much from your own considerable experience in this office. It proves you knew the railroad's likely route months before you began systematically tightening terms on every property along it," Marcus said, "including Mrs. Renner's, whose note you called due considerably earlier than its original term specified, on grounds I've reviewed carefully and find considerably harder to justify than your bank's official correspondence suggests. I've cross-referenced 6 other properties along that same route, Mr. Pruitt, each showing the identical pattern of early calls and adjusted interest, timed within weeks of your own private acquisition of that survey information." Something in Pruitt's careful composure finally shifted. The particular tell of a man discovering that evidence he'd assumed safely buried in routine paperwork had been more thoroughly examined than he'd anticipated. "You'd risk your own position on this," Pruitt said, "for a widow's 160 acres of unremarkable prairie. I'd think a man of your evident intelligence would recognize which side of this particular arrangement actually serves his own interests." "I recognize precisely which side serves my own conscience," Marcus said, "which I've come to value considerably more than continued employment under a man capable of doing to others exactly what was done to my own family 20 years ago." He did not confess outright that first confrontation, but the weight of Marcus's evidence, combined with a formal complaint Marcus filed with the Territorial Banking Commission the following week, produced enough scrutiny that Pruitt's board of directors, considerably more concerned with the bank's reputation than with defending one president's personal profit scheme, quietly extended my own note's terms and, within the month, removed Pruitt from his position entirely. The Banking Commission's own investigation, which took the better part of 2 months to properly conclude, uncovered 6 additional properties along the same likely railroad route that had suffered similar treatment, several of them already foreclosed and sold to intermediaries before Marcus's intervention, families who had already lost what my own delayed notice had ultimately spared me from losing myself. I want to record that this particular knowledge, learning how many others had not been fortunate enough to have a Marcus Fielding assigned to their own foreclosure, tempered whatever relief I felt at my own situation's resolution with a considerable grief for those who had not been so lucky, a grief Marcus shared as fully as I did, given how directly it echoed his own family's considerably harder outcome 20 years before. I want to record that the week Marcus had originally been sent to enforce stretched, through his own quiet insubordination and considerable subsequent effort, into a resolution I had genuinely believed impossible the afternoon he first folded that notice away unread. My note was restructured on considerably fairer terms, the railroad's actual route, once publicly announced, confirmed my land's increased value in a way that made the restructured payments entirely manageable, and I found myself, by that summer, in a position to properly thank a man who had risked his own livelihood on behalf of a stranger's fence. "I don't require your thanks," Marcus told me one evening that summer, both of us sitting on my own porch in a conversation that had become, over those difficult weeks, a considerably more frequent occurrence than either of us had properly acknowledged. "I've made my peace with what I did, regardless of how it might have ended. I'd simply ask that you understand it wasn't entirely selfless. I've thought about my own father's foreclosure for over 20 years, Clara, and I finally had the chance to make certain it didn't happen to someone else the same way, in front of me, without my doing something about it." "That's not nothing," I said. "That's considerably more than most people manage, watching an injustice they're not personally required to address." I looked at him a long moment in the fading evening light, understanding, as I had come to understand gradually over those difficult weeks, that Marcus Fielding carried a particular quiet grief of his own, considerably different from mine but no less real for its difference. "I confess I spent that first week suspicious of you, Marcus, unable to properly understand why a bank's own agent would risk everything on behalf of a stranger. I understand it rather better now. I'll admit I wasn't entirely certain, myself, riding out here that first afternoon, exactly what I intended to do," Marcus said. "I only knew I couldn't read that notice aloud and simply ride away afterward, whatever the consequence to my own position turned out to be. Everything that followed, I worked out considerably more by instinct than by any careful plan. One day's delay leading to the next, until somewhere along the way delay became genuine investigation, and investigation became something I couldn't in good conscience abandon regardless of the personal cost." I looked out at the same fence line he'd repaired that first afternoon, now standing solid and unremarkable in the summer evening light, and found myself considering how thoroughly one man's quiet decision, made in the span of perhaps 30 seconds at my own gate, had reshaped the whole remaining course of both our lives. We were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the same homestead he'd first arrived to foreclose upon. My closest neighbors and Marcus's few remaining relatives from Kansas gathered at the very fence line he'd once repaired without explanation. And I want to record that Marcus left the bank's employment entirely within the year, unable, he told me, to properly reconcile